Hello, everyone. I'm Pinar Givanch, and welcome to What's Wrong with the Podcast. Today, we have the great pleasure of speaking with Luke Williams. Luke is a leading business thinker, speaker, and author, having lectured in 21 countries. He has addressed the World Innovation Forum and the United Nations General Assembly. He is professor of innovation and design at NYU Stern School of Business and the founder of IdeaSkills. Williams is the inventor of 30 plus US patents and has designed more than 100 products in industries ranging from transportation to finance and healthcare to consumer electronics. His views are regularly featured in media ranging from Bloomberg, Fast Company, Wall Street Journal, and The Economist. He is the author of the international bestseller Disruptive, Think the Unthinkable to Spark Transformation in Your Business. With that, enjoy. Hello. Welcome to our podcast. Today we have the absolute pleasure of speaking with Luke Williams. Luke is a consultant, educator, and speaker in disruptive innovation. He also happens to be the author of Disrupt, this book, which I have loved reading. Luke, welcome.
Thanks, Pinar. Happy to be here.
Thank you for making the time for us.
Thank you for reading the book. You're the one. That's great.
I'm sure one of many people who did that. So we're so happy that you're here. We've been very much looking forward to this conversation. So please, for our audience, if you can tell a little bit more about yourself and also tell us why you became very passionate about disruptive innovation, that'll be great.
Yeah, so I'm not from around here, for starters. If people are listening to this in the United States, you can tell I don't have that accent. So I'm from Australia originally. My background is industrial design, so product design. And I think Australia is an amazing country, and I think you can have an incredible marketing career there, because that was my other part of the background. But I really didn't have, at the time, a big manufacturing base. Well, probably still doesn't. So you couldn't really get involved in some of the key decisions that were being made on which sort of products to make and which products to manufacture and all the rest of it. So you could market those products, but I wanted a seat at the table, you know, wherever that table was, where these decisions were being made. And at that time, this was overseas. And I've always been one of these guys that had 10 companies around the world he just cut off his left arm to work for. And I made a list of those companies. I rang them all from Australia. I said, look, I'm going to be, in town. I wasn't asking for a job. I just told them how much I loved what they did. And I said, can I come in and for an informational interview, basically learn more about what you did. And, to my surprise, all of them said yes. I don't know if it was me coming all that way, but they all said yes. So we were going to be this was around 2000 and the turn of the millennium. I was going to be overseas with a bunch of friends, and I thought, right, this is when I'm going to do that tour. So after that New Year's Eve, I basically went to, Europe and through America. And Pinar, I can tell you, it was great learning experience, but it wasn't going that well. I had one interview left, and I remember ringing home the night before that interview, just distraught, thinking, I've wasted so much money. Everyone was telling me that, you're never going to make it over here, because all my experience had been in designing packaging. And America is so big that, unless you're going to go work for a packaging company, which I didn't want to do any more of, they said, look, why would we hire you when 80% of our job is designing computers? We could go get someone who's done that for most of their time. So I was really distraught. I had one left, and it happened to be my top choice, which was Frog Design. Frog had got famous working for Apple, and they have a long history. I was so obsessed with Frog. They used to advertise on the back page of a design magazine. I used to color photocopy those, put them up around my room. That's how obsessed I was. So I didn't think it was going to go anywhere. But when I walked in, it was dramatically different. It felt like I was at home. Whatever I was saying resonated with them. I got back to Australia, and I thought there might be a chance here. 6 months later, they sent me a job offer, and it was the happiest day of my life. I thought, unbelievable. I can't believe I pulled that off. So anyway, that's what brought me to the United States.
I love that so much, and it's so inspirational. I feel like a lot of people who are like graduates now looking for jobs are like, okay, maybe I do a phone call to like 10 different countries and 10 different companies and go
Yeah,
around the
I
world.
don't know what it is. I don't. It doesn't matter what you believe in, but you've got to put some effort in, and then the world seems to meet you halfway. You know, I have a lot of graduate students because I'm an MBA prof, and they all want career advice. And I ask, well, what do you want to do? Most of them actually don't know. They don't know the companies they want to work for. So part of my advice to, graduates and people wanting to work is, go get it like an edition of Fast Company, 50 most innovative companies, for example. I used to go through these lists, read through, see what makes your hair stand up on the back of your neck, like gets you really excited. And then like do whatever you can to find out more about them, get an informational interview. And the more effort and the more you get to know them and the more passionate you are about giving your intellectual energy and talent to a company, the more they can see that. And I just think it really works out. So that's what that's the advice I give to the students. The other thing I actually tell them related to that is be very careful with who you give that energy and that creative talent to. The world desperately needs new ideas. We need new solutions for everything. And so the creative energy that you bring, your ideas, they are unique. They're not easily substituted at all. So whatever you bring to the table is unique. Be very careful with who you give those ideas to and where you want to invest that energy. That's the other piece of advice.
Oh my God, I love your already like sprinkling advice. And I would have paid good money for you to be my professor back in college. But anyways, a little late in that, that's why we're doing a podcast. So let's fast forward, shall we? So they gave you a job offer, you moved to US. And I want to say the rest is history, but let's talk about that history a little bit.
Well, I was so excited, and my family made me a cake in the shape of a frog, and we had this big goodbye party. And I got over there, and the timing was April 2001. Now, you know what happened at that time. I
Oh
was
my
moving to
God.
Silicon Valley, and I'd been reading books on Silicon Valley, like The Nudist on the Late Shift, and they were talking about Silicon Valley being the Florence of the New Renaissance. And I said, I definitely want to be at the Florence of the New Renaissance. This is going to be amazing. And I got over to the Florence of the New Renaissance, and all of a sudden the dot-com bust hit, and literally it was so depressing. Everyone was getting fired, laid off. I drive down from San Francisco down, 280 or 101 down to Silicon Valley, and the highway and the freeway were deserted. And I thought, I'm going to get laid off. This is going to be the shortest US tour in history. I just got a frog cake, for goodness sake. And I'm going to be back within, 2 weeks with my tail between my legs. So it was not a fun time. But luckily, I made it through that round of layoffs. And then I found a way of really delivering unique value that nobody else was delivering in the consultancy at the time, which is another thing I tell the students as well. In consulting's a good lesson for this, because you're on billable hours. And what it means is if you're not getting on projects, you're not getting billable hours. So it means you're on the bench. And when layoff rounds come around, they look at who's got the billable hours and who's on the bench. And in consulting, you do not want to be on the bench. And the thing about design is if your ideas are not getting through to the next round, then you are not getting hours to develop those ideas. So you end up, you get a chance to submit your ideas like all the other designers. But if your ideas aren't getting picked for the next round, you're on the bench. So I had to work out, how am I going to get my ideas through? How are they going to get chosen? How am I going to produce more ideas than any other designer? How am I going to make sure my ideas are some of the ideas getting picked for the next round? And that's how I sort of try to increase my value.
But that's amazing. You're already basically talking about like strategic design, right? Like you're going into strategizing about the next steps too, because if we do that in the end, we realize innovation, right? And there are so many reasons why we're not like realizing innovation in corporations or consultancy, like in general in the world today. Meanwhile,
we have too many problems and we need all the innovation and all the new ideas that we can implement.
Yeah.
So what would be your like perspective on that? So you saw that already, right? Like you saw that there has to be a certain way of approaching design to continue to have people like inspired and continue the journey. And also, what did you observe that was happening that was blocking that along the way?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. We need more ideas. We need more people being creative. I think a lot of ideas get stuck in people's heads and we're not getting them out in the right way. So when I got to Frog, I had been in marketing too long and I was talking too much and I was thinking too much and I was not getting my ideas down on paper. Now, the founder of Frog Design is a guy called Hartmut Esslinger, and he and Steve Jobs were tight. And I only say that because it led to him impacting the way Steve Jobs would design his internal design team at Apple. But anyway, Hartmut had this phrase, which was sketch it out. So you'd approach him and you'd start talking about an idea. He would not listen to you. He would put his hand up and walk away shouting, sketch it out, which meant go and visualize your idea. Go and describe your idea. Go and do some work on that idea. And when we had these creative reviews, basically everyone, there was no talking about ideas. Like every idea had to be sketched out and it had to be on a wall and there was no hiding. Once it's on that wall, it's almost not your idea anymore because it's a creative review. So then all these people from different parts are brought in and that's the collaborative process. So one of the things that taught me very quickly is to stop thinking too much about my ideas and just get them on paper and then get them into a form where people can give feedback on them. And this is what I teach in my innovation course so much because I'm teaching MBA students. They're not used to being designers. But there is a lot of this. There's a lot of, conceptualizing in the head or an Excel spreadsheet and not properly visualizing and articulating these ideas and these solutions in a form where they can get the proper feedback or the right feedback. So that's a big part of what we're focused on.
Yeah, it's like activation in the process, right? Like you kind of like turning it into something that active where others can comment on. You can think further on, like maybe once you visualize, you're going to be like, that was not a good idea, right? But it kind of helps you get to the next step. Yeah. Whereas like when you just talk about it, it gets stuck here. And then we do a good job at that, right? We see in many industries, there's a lot of talking and not necessarily action. So I'm hearing like step one, like visualization, right? Like get it out there so it can also become a more collaborative act. And maybe it sparks like other ideas too. And from there, like, let's continue the journey. What's next? Like, what do you feel like kind of like brings you a step closer to a realization?
Well, I figured, so I was a designer at that point. And so my goal was to get as many ideas on that board as possible. There was a guy who was so talented. His name was Howie. We're still good friends. And Howie could sketch. We used to call anyone who could sketch well a sketch monkey. Man, Howie was a sketch monkey. And Howie would have 10 ideas for my every one. So, and at that point, like I said before, if he's got 10 ideas and I've only got one, he's got a better chance of getting his ideas through the next round. So the first thing was quantity. The second thing was sort of the quality of the sketch and getting it out there. And I still think that applies today. But where I was going with that is that's all well and good for an individual contributor when you're a designer. Because what happens then is somebody is coming in and picking those directions. And in Frog Design, and you're an IDEO or a Frog or any innovation consultancy, it's normally the creative director. So the creative director comes in, maybe the engineering director, maybe the director of strategy. Anyway, the directors come in and they're sort of picking the directions. And then, eventually I became a creative director and the emphasis shifted from me contributing ideas to being the one who was sort of having to pick the directions and respond to other people's ideas. And of course, any leadership position is a change from individual contributor to actually managing other people. And there's lots of books and literature on how to do that. in non-creative industries. There was no literature on how to be a creative leader or how to be a creative director, probably because people who are creative directors, I don't know, they don't write, they visualize or something, but there wasn't any literature on it. And it's a very different skill set. So that's why when I really became passionate about working out how to be a better creative leader, how to lead innovation teams, how to do this better within an organization. How do you actually evaluate and judge ideas in the right way? How do you learn to back an idea that you intuitively believe, based on all your prior experience, might be wrong? Which you often have to do as a creative director.
It's such different like skill set too. And there is no, and I mean, didn't used to, maybe that's changing a little bit. You don't necessarily like getting an education as an industrial designer. You don't necessarily study leadership skills a lot when you're getting into it, right? There's a lot of prepping you for the profession, like upskilling yourself with software and things like that. But getting to that position, you're kind of like, okay, I'm not gonna sketch anymore. I'm gonna like help the best ideas like emerge, and also I'm gonna like advocate for them if I have to, right? And this is where like also where you become the person not only responsible of like launching the design, but also kind of creating this like showroom experience to all other departments that are going to come into play, right? Supply chain comes in, manufacturing comes in, finance comes in, legal comes in, and you kind of need to like defend your idea or the team's idea to them. So what happens then? Like what starts like bubbling then, and what do you find yourself doing at that time?
Well, then I worked out. I worked out that a lot of the skills that I needed were counterintuitive skills. And I worked out a lot of the difference in innovation leadership is very different from what we call sustaining leadership, which is sustaining a core business or a current business and incrementally improving things, which is, to be honest, 98% of what we teach at a business school is in that realm of sustaining sort of leadership. There's very, very few courses and very few schools that know how to teach the sort of disruptive innovation that I was interested in. So my course has really been a learning journey in not only teaching other people to do it, but sort of trying to learn how to do it myself and actually better techniques. Because think about it, it's absolutely counterintuitive to search for alternative ways of thinking about a business when the business is at the peak of its success. It's absolutely counterintuitive to slowly experiment with long-term solutions when you need to address, these short-term pressing problems. I often joke that we educate leaders to be reasonable, rational decision makers. And then they get out there and we expect them to be irrational, unreasonable disruptors on the trail of the next breakthrough innovation. It just doesn't work. It's just crazy. So, part of my job is getting the students to unlearn a lot of what they've learned in some of the other MBA courses if they want to be good disruptive innovation leaders and practitioners. So working out what those counterintuitive tools are and how you can practice them, and then how you can encourage your organization to embrace these things and build a culture around them is really where I'm at now.
I love that so much. And it's an area that I'm super passionate about because, I think you and I talked about this before a little bit. Like we're living in an increasingly volatile world, right? And highly complex, if not chaotic at times. And this is just like, it's the pandemic, the economic crisis, supply chain crisis, the war, like all of that is not an example enough. I don't know what is, right? And this is like, seems to be like getting just more and more and more amplified every year. And so many of the solutions we have, or like methods or best practices, so to speak, we have in place are very much in, designed to operate in, a complicated system, right? Like experts come in, there are a few good practices, we choose one, we go with that. And it's like, there's more predictability built in. We kind of know what we don't know, right? But that's changing now. And I think what I'm seeing and feeling is like we try to innovate in a space that was designed for, I don't know, pre-COVID, pre-chat GPT, pre all the, like the new BC and AC, right?
Yeah.
I feel like these are like all these like new Cs are like changing our BC and AC. So, and it's almost like putting a fast train onto old tracks, right? And we're trying, and then we're like wondering why can't we innovate? Why do we launch something and it gets discontinued like a few months later? And yet we have so many ambitions and goals around ESG, 2030 vision, 2050 goals, like so much stuff around sustainability and inclusion. And yet, if this was a video game, we're at beginner level, right? We have
Yeah.
so much to do. So, with this context, like
Yeah.
what are some, I don't want to say best practices because almost like what you're also saying, like unlearning and also like finding kind of these like emergent solutions based on even your context, your own company, your own people, like every system is different. What do you see that are kind of like, I guess, good case examples of this like happening, or definitely like do's versus don't do's?
Well, I mean, you've hit the
Is
nail
it
on the
a
head there.
loaded
So
question?
I won't get into, I'll stay at a higher level right now, because I think you've hit
Okay.
on something super important, because, and it's not just pre-COVID. For most of human history, we didn't have to keep up with new ideas, right? Because ideas lived longer than people. So, for example, if you lived in the 12th century, you could just pluck someone out of that and put them in the 13th century. Life would be no different, really. So
Yeah.
progress was, really, really slow. Then beginning of the 18th century, we got this sudden change with the Industrial Revolution, but by 1900, you could say it took about 30 years for a
Mm.
big step in an idea, like a big idea change to make the world uncomfortably different. And now with, everything that's happening, it's often described as VUCA,
Yeah.
volatility, uncertainty, et cetera, artificial intelligence, all the rest of it. We're having to change our ideas like at least every 5 to 7 years. So what we have now is, we're perhaps the first, maybe second generation where people live longer than ideas, meaning you are going to have to change your core ideas. And by the
Right.
way, if our listeners don't like the word idea, just substitute it with belief. What's the idea or belief that's underlying every action and decision you're taking in your career, in your business, in your life on a day-to-day basis? Now, where did those ideas and beliefs come from? Usually they were conceived by somebody else in a different age and a different context. So we're having to change those core ideas and beliefs at least every 5 to 7 years. And now you throw a global, pandemic in there, and it's we're having to change some of these core ideas every month. Now, of course, my question is, where are our tools for changing ideas faster than ever before?
Right.
We don't have many tools for doing this because we've been dominated by one tool, and that is the dialectical clash, better known as argument. So you'll know it yourself, Pina.
Mm.
When somebody's got a new idea, what do they have to do? They have to criticize the existing idea or the old idea. They have to prove that current idea to be obsolete or wrong. And it's only when the current way of doing things is proven obsolete or wrong before we can even have a productive dialogue around changing it. And I'm talking about in most scenarios, in most businesses, in most organizations. The only exceptions would be the people, professionals who are paid to do this, like you guys and Frog Design and IDEO on a day-to-day basis where they're paid to have these conversations. But for most people, they cannot have a productive dialogue around new versus old. New ideas are usually rejected because they're evaluated through the framework of old ideas. So we've been completely dominated by this sort of argumentative clash and having to prove current ways of doing things wrong or obsolete before we can have, productive dialogue around how to change and what we might need to build capabilities in the future. So to sum all that up, we're now in a position where we desperately need to change the way we change.
Wow. And you're saying basically, I mean, it starts with going back to the basics of communication and collaboration, right? We first need to have a conversation and an open mind before like adoption, implementation, scaling, whatever, like everything that might come with the change. We first need to talk, and we're not even like great at that at times. And even like in an organization, not only, you know, even within a unit, it gets complex, but then you have like other departments, you have different regions, different countries, different cultures that get in the way, and who knows what other personal stuff that gets in the way of all of this. And so the question is, how do we prioritize or approach the need for change in an unbiased and open way? Like, and there can't be single recipe or prescription for that. To exactly to your point, there has to be a toolkit that you have for your like organization where you can like kind of need to like prototype and see along the way also like what works, right? Like, how do you observe? Well, I'm sure you talk about it in your classes about like the agility around all of this. Do you feel there's like picking up on that a little bit in leadership or in organizations today? Or again, are we at like beginner level?
You know, there are some encouraging signs in leadership. There's more emphasis on discursive practices now, or they're often called dialogical practices and dialogical organizational behavior or dialogic organizational behavior, for example. But really, here are three major things that need to happen for even these conversations and this productive dialogue to happen. The first is an organization needs to know that they can't just grow through continuity. Continuity means just incrementally doing, you know, what you've done before, you know, expecting that you were right at one point. So that'll, you know, just moving on the same path will ensure continued success. One of the myths about disruption is it creates chaos and instability. But if we think about a business as a system, and it's a business within an industry, so it's a system within a system, system dynamics apply. And when you've only got a reinforcing feedback loop, which is what growth through continuity is about in a business, it means you've got an unstable business. It means there's absolutely no way you can grow in a competitive, sustainable way. So for any system, meaning any business, to grow in a sustainable, competitive way, you need a counterbalance. You need a balancing loop. And that balancing loop is knowing it's not just your job to keep the existing core business running. You also have to be introducing deliberate discontinuity into the business on a regular basis. And discontinuity means you've got to be introducing ideas and potential strategies for the business that might be inconsistent or in direct conflict with what the current business is doing. So discontinuity means these ideas, which might threaten your existence, would never in a million years develop out of what you've got right now. They would never develop out of the existing system. So the first thing is to realize that we need disruption. We need discontinuity in our business, in our careers, in our lives, in order to grow. And that's what growth is about. And that's the starting point for, you know, everything else. And a lot of people can't get their head around that part. The, you know, the next part is the ideas, the output from that. You're going to have to find a way to encourage the business to experiment with more low probability options rather than only picking the high probability ideas and options. You know, everyone out there has been in a brainstorming session. All these ideas are thrown up on the wall. And what happens? They have a voting session at the end, and there's normally a top 5 picked with, you know, pretty arbitrary criteria. And the top 5 are the only ideas that get through. The rest are scrapped. And those top ideas are the most practical. They're the most usable. They're the highest probability ideas based on where we are now. And it's just a disaster. You know, the next thing is that you've got to know that most of the new ideas you're introducing are not going to be successful. But if you only believe that brainstorming and contributing new ideas is valuable if you implement the ideas, then this is a red flag because you can't possibly implement all the disruptive ideas that people are coming up with. So the thing that you have to, particularly if you're in a management position, think about is, how do I reward people for the effort of contributing fresh thinking and new ideas, regardless of the outcome of that thinking, of those ideas? Because if your only way of rewarding them is to implement what they're suggesting, their motivation's going to dry up super fast because you just can't possibly implement all those creative suggestions. So you need to reward effort and not result. And that is just huge, because so many of our performance plans and everything else are all around rewarding result, regardless
Right.
of effort.
Right, right. I mean, I think you hit the nail there, because if we really want to like unleash innovation, and what I'm hearing also from what you're saying is like innovation, like new ideas, disruptive ideas, is merely a survival strategy at this point if you want to be a relevant brand or company like 10, 20 years from now, not even maybe 5 years from now, considering the pace of like everything changing today. And to your point, like if we really want to enable that, the problem is not necessarily it's like we don't have enough like good ideas, right? It's like the system we're operating in where they're going to take place. And in that
Yep.
system, in these systems, the fact that we're incentivizing and rewarding results, or if we're designing the KPIs in the wrong way, right? And it's really like easy to blame that, and then you're kind of also seeing, oh, like let's say I'm a mother with like 2 kids, I need to be at home by like, or need to do pickup at 5 p.m. There are 2 potential projects. One is high risk, we don't know where that one is going, right? And if I don't deliver on time, it's going to look bad on me, and probably I'm going to be blamed for my like motherhood. Versus the other one is like a franchise project, right? Like 2.0 of something that already worked out. It's way more like safe, and it's better, it works better with my life. So I have to go with that. And I also need to make a living, right? Because you can't really blame the individual within the system because the system becomes the enabler of that. And then we're questioning like, oh, why it is like getting harder and harder to like innovate within like corporations. And that's exactly what you described in terms of like, well, what is the approach towards innovation? How is it set up? Like, how is it incentivized? Is it given enough space to be whatever it needs to be, which is quite messy and not necessarily always pretty, right? And I think that is like, and this is like going back to what we were saying in terms of like try to like place a fast train on an old track. Like, what do we really need to change within like organizational culture? And even like systems in place and mechanisms in place in order to enable that. And meanwhile, like when we're so focused on the innovation itself and what didn't work and what should we learn from that, I don't think, or at least I'm not seeing, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, I don't see enough spotlight on the areas that keep like, turning the hamster wheel. I think we're seeing over and over again what happens within innovation efforts where we're not like spotlighting a conversation that we really should be like spotlighting. And which is why I think you have basically this book to remind people that it's not just about, we can't like study the problems of an innovation within its like own bubble. We have to like have an understanding of its ecosystem.
Well, one of the biggest issues, and this is why I like conversations like this, because you could skip all the superficial surface stuff and get to some of the foundational stuff, which is driving a lot of these behaviors. One of the things driving everyone's behavior and why we're so bad at innovation and change is that we just don't value ideas. We believe ideas are the easy part. We believe they're cheap. We believe they're free. I used to run the Entrepreneurship Center at NYU Stern, and we deal with a lot of VCs, and we have judges in. And I heard it again and again and again. Ideas, I have a million of them before breakfast. It's the execution that matters. And this it drives me crazy, because what that means,
Oh, wow.
to back up on our earlier dialogue, is that they're only interested in successful ideas. So any idea that's not successful was more bother than it's worth. But this is missing a fundamental point about ideas. The world of things and the world of ideas don't work the same way, but we still treat them as though they did. The world of things is about a scarcity mindset. We've only got these, scarce resources. We have to be incredibly strategic with the decisions we make and how we allocate these scarce resources. The world of ideas is about abundance. It's not about scarcity. So it's about abundance mindset, meaning if I give you my idea, Pinar, you get the idea, I still have it, we can both use it. So we can both use that idea at the same time. We can combine it with our ideas, and the possibilities of those combinations don't just add up, they multiply. It's got an exponential growth effect. So while there might be limits to growth in the physical world, there are no limits to how you can grow value and wealth for yourself and for your organization. It just means that you have to look at the current resources that are available and find a way of arranging those resources in an alternative way that makes them more valuable. And that's really what innovation's about. I often use a cooking metaphor to describe this. We define ideas as the recipes you use to create new value and wealth. So part of it is taking the ingredients that are already available. This isn't even about inventing new ingredients. It's the willingness to take those ingredients, seek a new arrangement for those ingredients that makes them more valuable. And that's how growth in value actually occurs. So we have to move past thinking about ideas only as valuable if they're executed, and think of ideas as a form of currency in their own right. They're items of investment. They give you optionality. So the old days of knowing exactly where your career, your business, your industry is going, those days are over, as we've already discussed. So now you've got to get your career, your business, your industry into a position where you can do option A, B, C, D, E, or any of those, depending on how the circumstances change. And ideas give you that optionality.
I love that. And I think you also touched upon a part where, like, I have an idea, I shared it with you, you start marinating that idea, right? And it's already also showing the mindset and attitude around ideas too. We also witness in innovation space, like people becoming too protective of their ideas, even if before it got somewhere, right? But it's my idea and we shouldn't say, and we shouldn't mention. And then when you're launching something out into the world, you don't share your ideas that went along with it, and it's all treated like a black box, and then nobody like relates to it. So it's like, I think we have, I mean, how I see it, and this maybe it comes from the abundance attitude you're talking about. Like, I feel like we have too many problems in the world. Only good things can come out of like us sharing more and more, because we're not going to solve any of this alone. And we really, it's very arrogant for us to think like there's no problem solving. We can't even address the problems that we're like facing, right? Like by ourselves. And the more we share, the more collaborative this becomes, also the better. And I love that you started with the example of like, sketch it out, put it on the wall. So it already becomes collaborative, and it already stops belonging to you, right? It's out there. It's something to incubate on together. And I think in addition to kind of like the challenge we see around how we're incentivized and what is that leading to, this is also another way, like the culture or attitude in an organization on how much sharing, ideating, and discussion around ideas is really happening. Going back to our like earlier comment on like communication as well. So I love that you already like built in like explaining like this is a quite collaborative effort, and we definitely can't have less of that, especially in the world that we're living today.
Yeah, the sharing is super important, because if you don't get that, if you're not into the sharing of ideas, you're missing out on what makes ideas special. So you miss out on that increasing in terms of that exponential growth of knowledge effect. So you have to fundamentally understand that the world of things and the world of knowledge don't work the same way. And there's different academic terms for getting into that, and we probably don't need to get into it. But that is, that's a fundamental mindset shift. And the next part of that is once you're open to sharing, you have to be sharing in the right way. This gets us back to our conversation around, this wasted argument and clash. So whenever you share a new idea with someone in your business or a client or an organization, it should never be a criticism of the existing way of doing something, because there's always going to be some defender of the status quo in the audience, in the judges panel, with your client.
Right.
And what happens is they're going to defend the status quo, which means you're going to have to attack with more vigor, which means they're going to dig their heels in. And that's where we start to get this argumentative clash. So whenever you're sharing a new idea, it is never a criticism of the existing way of doing something. You're just putting the new up against the current way of doing something to discuss the differences between these two things. You're under absolutely no pressure to implement the new idea. You're just having it for the sake of a productive dialogue. Now, that productive dialogue does a lot of things. One of the things it does is a fancy strategy term called dynamic capability. It increases your dynamic capability. That means your capacity to change. So even if you're not implementing ideas as an individual, as a business, when you need to change, if you've had enough of these discussions and you're used to seeing new ideas and you're used to having a dialogue around what's new versus what's old and the differences between them, when the time comes to actually change, you'll have an easier time of doing it, because the rigidity with which everyone's holding on to the current way of doing things has been reduced over time. So building dynamic capability is absolutely, it's such a critical thing in the 21st century when things are moving so fast.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it won't be a bad idea to have like a set of like house rules going into a meeting. Like, the rules of this meeting is you cannot say this or do that or whatever. Like, really, like a school approach. I almost feel like,
Well, I'm glad you said that, actually, because we do need some rules around dialogue when discussing new ideas versus old ideas. And we have to move past the traditional rules of brainstorming. Normally the only rules that people have up are the ones that Alex Osborne came up with over 60 years ago in the book Applied Imagination, which is on the shelf back there somewhere. No idea is a bad idea, and deferred judgment. It's impossible to defer judgment. Let me tell you. Well, it's not just me telling you. I mean, Danny Kahneman's up there with research telling us it's impossible to defer judgment. People have already judged your idea. They don't like it. We don't respond well to things we're not familiar with. So the more disruptive your idea, the less people are going to like it. Does that mean it's a bad idea? Not necessarily. Or does it just mean, well, they're not used to it, so they're not reacting well to it? We're seeing all this play out with the Apple Vision Pro, by the way. The number of predictions about failure is just staggering, because not many of us grew up desiring to wear a VR headset, and not many of us have worn a VR headset, so we don't react well to something we're not familiar with. Now, I don't have a dog in this fight, as I often say, but it brings up a ton of interesting points about how we cannot defer judgment. So, for example, to get back to our rules, you need rules and procedures that help you move past judgment and extract maximum value from whatever idea or suggestion you're hearing before rejecting the idea or suggestion. So there's deliberate tools on how you can extract maximum value from what you're hearing, how you can facilitate a more productive discussion around what you're hearing rather than just rejecting it outright. So I agree. We need these rules.
Yeah, I mean, there's judgment and bias is always in the room, and they're like waiting to hear this like one comment. I see this also in like consumer testing, right? Like we might get feedback like, oh, I don't like this, and they're like, they said that.
Yeah.
They're like waiting for that like validation, and there's no like filtering or digesting of what that actually means, and the whys of what we're hearing is like we're hearing that, right? And I think it's actually, I mean, I love this saying just because it's common sense doesn't mean it's common practice. And I think it's exactly what's happening. Like when we talk about it like this, it feels like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But implementation is a whole other, thing, like practicing these, like setting out
Yeah.
rules, like listening to each other, collaborating, sharing. Even though like these are things that I talk to my, 4-year-old toddler about, like, right? But it doesn't mean that it gets like implemented all the
Yeah.
time. But I would, I could talk to you all day, that's for sure, Luke. So I really do need to like wrap up here. I think you already sprinkled the entire like conversation with so many great advice. I just want to like maybe take a step back. If for anyone who really wants to like push for progress or like change or push boundaries a little bit, right? This can be them like getting uncomfortable in the space that they're in. This might be like them getting into a career that they think that's going to allow for them to do so. What would be your advice to them? Maybe like call them up and say, I'm going to visit based on your experience, but what else?
Well, the big thing I think people should take away and concentrate on is that the 21st century challenge is conceptual, not technological. And I hesitate to use the word conceptual because for some of the reasons we've talked about already on this with this conversation, whenever people hear conceptual, they think, oh, that means talking things to death and not getting stuff done. But what we forget is getting stuff done always means getting stuff done within the perceived boundaries of what you believe is achievable and acceptable. And those perceived boundaries of what you believe is achievable and acceptable constitute your conceptual limitations. It's the metaphorical box that we're always talking about and like saying you need to think outside the box. We're really talking about your conceptual limitations. And, so AI, for example, is a very powerful tool, generative AI, fantastic. But if you're just using it to think within, the metaphorical box that you're already within, if you're using it to sort of remain within the boundaries of what you believe is achievable and acceptable for whatever you're focused on, that's not leveraging the AI to its full capability. So to go back to the cooking metaphor, we often use all these new technologies just to cook our existing recipes a little bit better, a little bit faster, a little bit more, cheaper. What I'm saying is, growth in the career of the listeners, in their businesses, in their industries, growth in the next 5 to 10 years is going to come from them creating better recipes, not doing just more cooking. So that's the key thing.
Oh my God. And we dropped the mic with that and just exited. That was perfect, Luke. Thank you. I think it was like very inspiring, but also in a very productive way. I think there are a lot of actionable insights out of this like conversation. So we very much appreciate your time. If anybody hasn't read this book, Disrupt, you have to read it. It's so good and so like motivating because you feel like you actually have power to do something no matter what space you're in and no matter how rigid your system feels. So thank you so much for making the time. And we look forward to your upcoming books.
Thanks, Pinar. I appreciate you having me on. It was a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that is this week's episode of What's Wrong with the Podcast. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Links can be found in the episode description, and you can also find them on our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz. If you found value in the show, we would appreciate if you could rate us and leave a review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Don't forget to join us next week. Thank you for listening.